So I think it's time to restart our program. We now have our second session on higher education institutions and their main stakeholders. I have three speakers this afternoon. Professor Elizabeth Balbochevsky from Brazil, double presentation by Professor Kinjal Vijay Ahir and Ashwath Priya from India, and Dr. Peliwi Loluana from South Africa. So I'll call Dr. Elizabeth Balbochevsky to start. Dr. Elizabeth is with the Department of Political Science at the University of São Paulo. She holds a habilitation in political science by the University of São Paulo. She's deputy coordinator with the Center for the Research on Public Policy of the University of São Paulo, and the associate professor of the Department of Political Science, and she's a fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies Higher Education Group. Now I give the floor to...
Okay, thank you. Well, my mission here is to highlight some major articulations inside of what we could call the policy arena of higher education in Brazil. So I think I'm going to work this. First of all, calling your attention for two issues that I think it's three issues, in fact, that it's very important to understand the dynamics of policy decision-making in Brazil. First of all, higher education community was a very important player in the struggle for democratization, the country in the 70s and 80s. And this made higher education community, especially the unions inside higher education, public higher education universities, and academics, scientific leaders inside the universities, very highly visible players in our, what we could call in our political system. So I think that one point that it is very important to understand is the strength of these actors in the policy arena. It's very difficult, for instance, for our policymakers just to overlook what are the main perspectives, demands, and issues posed by these actors. They are very powerful. They have strong veto powers inside this arena. So it's not so easy for the bureaucracies in the government, in the parliament, to overcome these actors in the decision-making process in Brazil. So, first of all, our democratic rule, it creates alternatives for mobilizing interests in the society also. I think that one of the most important issues that came out of the political system to decision is the demand for increased access to higher education. It's not just a thing that the people think it would be interesting, but I think that there is a strong organized interests inside the society that push for increasing access to higher education, and most of it, the most important, is the issue about inequalities in the access to higher education. One of the answers to this issue is the establishing quotas inside the public universities. Another another answer is to expand scholarships for poor students to attend private education. But there is a relevant issue about increasing access, increasing equality in the access to higher education. First of all, because in Brazil, we have two different systems. One is the private sector, where it's not only that the students share the costs of higher education. The student's family pay for all the costs of higher education, including in these systems, they are asked to pay for example, the costs of academics research, since the academics employed at the private sector are not allowed to have access to the public funds for research. They are supposed to pay for the full cost of all the infrastructure of these institutions, these universities, and things like that. While on the public sector, they are altogether free. They are tuition free, they have scholarships, they have access to special programs for students to be involved in research, postgraduate, master and doctoral programs are completely tuition free. So this kind of situation creates a perception, I would say that it highlights the problem of inequality of access, the problem of the inequality of access to the public universities. Because public universities is not only tuition free, but is regarded as the best institutions in the country. So the people used to say, well, the poor pay and the rich don't have all free for them. It's not really the real description of the pictures, because the figures are not altogether so simple. But this is the perception that is spread in the society. So I would say that that equity and social inclusiveness is a central issue, both for the social pact that sustains democracy in Brazil. This is a very important issue. It's impossible for our country to overlook this problem in any perspective. You can say whatever you want, but the government is supposed to sustain very strong social programs for support poor families, to give minimal wage for minimal income for all families and things like that. I think it's a core issue for our democratic pact in Brazil. So, evidently, this is also an issue for higher education policies. If you look at the external stakeholders agenda, you see that we have, first of all, this main issue related to the low inclusiveness of Brazilian higher education. You have the historical underrepresentation of minorities, especially the black people in Brazilian higher education, especially in the public universities. So there is a strong pressure coming from NGOs, from minority movements toward a more active, affirmative acts, policies for incorporating these parts of the society into the public sector, because the public sector is the goal of, is the golden apple of our higher education system. And then there is issues related between the interplay between research and society. In particular, I think that there is an issue of social relevance of research that it's paid by public funds in Brazil. This is an issue that it's advocated mostly by the bureaucracies in the science agencies in Brazil. Why? Because this is the best way they have to defend their participation in the budgetary process in the federal and in the state level government. So this is very important for the legitimacy of science policy in Brazil. So this is an issue for the bureaucracy. I would not say that this is really a core issue for the business sector in Brazil. The business sector is much more interested in the people higher education institutions are providing, not really research. Research is not a high level in the agenda of the business sector, the business, the industry, and things like that. Okay. And then there is an expectation coming from the business sector, as I said before, which is mostly related to the quality of education, quality of undergraduate education. Undergraduate education is a first professional degree. We don't have the undergraduate as such. There is in more Anglo-Saxon tradition. We have in Brazil more continental European tradition where the students, when they attend the undergraduate, they are attaining a professional degree. And this is a very ingrained in our imagination. Even if you are doing a study in a basic science, you are supposed to become a professional in this science, but a professional. If you are doing a degree, a first degree in social science, you are supposed to be a social scientist, whatever it means. But anyway, so there, from the part of the business sector, I found out that there is the central issue is the quality of education related to the employability of these students after leaving the university. From the part of the government, the executive, the main issue is related to imposing strong controls over the private sector. Private sector, as I said this morning, in Brazil is regarded as needed evil, but it doesn't become better because it needs to exist. In fact, I think that for many people in Brazil, if we could just erase private education, it would be the best of the world. Unfortunately, as Professor Peter has said, we cannot pay for all the students studying for free in public universities with academics employed full-time and with a very low teaching load in their contracts. So we need to support the private sector because, well, private sector cater for the students that cannot be accepted in the public sectors. But since they are not good students, they are supposed to pay for their education, and the better students don't pay anything. Another goal very important for the government is to expand public sector, public universities. As Professor Clarissa showed us in the morning, the public sector, the public enrollments in the public sector is really a minority in Brazil. Almost 73% of all our undergraduate students are enrolled in private institutions. So just a very teeny fraction of these students attend the public universities. And the public universities, this situation is perceived as not a very good. So there is a push, very important, but from the government, especially from the federal government, which is to expand this sector, include more students, include the students that are not the traditional young student that can be full-time at the universities. And this is carried out mainly by pushing for increasing students per academics, opening evening courses at the federal universities and also at the state level universities, launching new universities, and opening new campuses in the country's poorest area. But what I think is very interesting is that there is a small connection between the authorities, the people that live in these poor areas, and the government, the federal government that push for creating these new universities. So it's not unusual to have a kind of Frankenstein kind of university, where the university are planned to be a kind of world-class university with a lot of research, and it is placed in a very poor area where they don't have not even candidates for their places. And then there is a kind of mismatch of this kind. It's very usual. We have this experience at the University of São Paulo. We have this experience at the State University of North Fluminense. We have this experience at the Federal University of the ABC, Brasilia. It's amazing. I think that this is a very interesting trait in our university system, is that because we don't have a kind of board of trustee or something like that, we have poor channels to create a real dialogue with the society. So we really, we don't, as my rector at my university once told me, he said, well, okay, we are protected against the São Paulo governor, but we are not protected against the crazy people inside the university that just propose something, and then you cannot say that, no, it will not work. We don't have people for this. No, someone will appear. So this is a very interesting way things function here. And then I think that there is another actor that it is very important for higher education policies in Brazil, which is the judiciary. Why? Because the judiciary in Brazil is very policy active. In the absence of decisions of laws, they took the laws on their mind. So the judiciary is very active in supervising the universities, supervising the way the university expend the money, and things like that. He is a very important player. And the people, the judge, and the people from the judiciary, they have in mind what they think is the best way university should be organized in Brazil. They think that education as a right means that you should enforce access to higher education as a kind of universal right. Anyone that knock at their door, they try to force a place for the people. They support access, affirmative action. They see higher education as a pure public good, so it's not legitimate to impose tuitions or any kind of price in access of the services, especially the public universities are supposed to offer. Teaching, services, research, anything like that. They have a strong opposition to entrepreneurship and marketization of universities. So they have their own ideas about how higher education should work, and they impose it because they are constantly rising issues, creating new process against the rector, against this director, another director, and things like that. Internal stakeholders, you have, in fact, four very relevant stakeholders. First of all, I think that we have the academic elite, the research, senior research inside the best universities. They have a strong commitment to graduate education and research. They have strong expectations linked to disciplinary cultures, and they are open to the pressures posed by the government regarding the research social relevance. It means for them this is important, but the most important issue is the disciplinary culture. They are allowed to do some relevant, social relevant research, as long as they are allowed also to do basic research, which is the disciplinary more important to them. I think that a novelty in the reality in Brazil is the emergence of research community in the dynamic areas such as nanotechnology, biotechnology, and things like that. For these small communities, the exchange between university and society and enterprises and public service and things like that, it's very important because it's in this exchange that they find new issues for their research, new approaches and things like that. For them, this is very important, but they are a very small community, but very active inside the university. For this academic elite, also the centrality of merit-based values are very important. And this centrality creates some resistance to policies regarding affirmative action. For many of these top researchers inside the Brazilian science community, this kind of policy is viewed with, at least with some regard. It's not really well accepted. And then you have the unions inside the universities. The union usually cater for academics with lower degree committed to undergraduate education with small or poor qualifications for research. This is their public, although they say, of course, that they are the union for all the faculty in a university. In fact, they are the voice of these academics that have, let's say, chalky qualifications for a real academic life. And for them, egalitarian rules are very important. And these people are very strong in Brazil. We had in the last 3 or 4 months a very long strike. And one of the issues of this strike you cannot imagine, our guests would not imagine, was that separate the merit from the career, so that an academic could reach the position of full professor without even having a doctoral degree, not publishing at all, only because he was a long time in the university. This was a demand. This was the demand brought by the unions. And it was very important and very popular because it created, it sustained almost 4-month strike. Of course, there were other issues inside this strike, but this issue, it's very important inside the universities. They are against evaluation, of course, any kind, but they support affirmative action. They are really in favor of this kind of policy. And they have a strong connection with the student movements in Brazil. Student movements, student unions in Brazil are strongly connected with this perspective of the egalitarianism, of real flat organization where the academics is teachers and nothing more than teachers. We have the public university central authorities. They are mostly vulnerable of the pressures posed by the government. And then, finally, in the private sector, the private sector has differentiated a lot in the few last years. They are posing a perspective that education is a private good in the economic sense. The best issue they put forward is employability. They are, of course, in favor of tuition. They are in search of new niches for differentiation. They are trying to explore technological education, vocational education. They create very, very strange degrees. For instance, a bachelor degree in chief of cooking. And yeah, there is a bachelor degree in fashion design and things like that. But they are very dynamic in this sense because they are trying, in this search, they explore and offer new opportunities of very tailor-made programs for the job market. So they are in this sense, some of these institutions are very dynamic in the sense that they are always trying to create new alternatives of programs and things like that. We have a minor subsector that is mostly formed by denominational and other community-oriented institutions. These institutions are nowadays under a strong pressure posed by the heavy regulations created by the government. And these institutions are trying to survive inside this process of strong concentration in the mass-oriented private sector. What happens is that, considering that all the institution is supposed to survive only on the basis of tuitions, they need scale in order to survive. So there is a process of strong concentration, creation, very huge for-profit universities that face this kind of pressure posed by the government. And then there is an elite sector in search for prestige. Prestige, differentiation, they cater for rich students coming from upper level families and things like that. So, just for finishing my presentation, I would say that there are we can identify at least three coalitions inside higher education arena. First of all, we have a kind of utilitarian coalition which held together the private sector, the business sector, that emphasize the thematic about the economic value of higher education, education as a private goal, good, and the main issue is quality of education, quality meaning that it is the education, the higher education, put in the market people that can be used, have high level of employability. And then you have another coalition which I called the egalitarian coalition. It's composed mostly by the unions in the public sector, the NGOs, sorry, this is a Portuguese, the NGOs that are at the same time against merit. They are against the idea of the university as a service institution. They propose that the university should be totally dependent on the public money. The university are not supposed to have any kind of third source of income. They are totally against entrepreneurship inside the higher education. And then you have what I called the academic entrepreneurs, both at the public and the private sector. They see the university as a place for science, but science perceived as mostly an opportunity for doing business, not business necessarily as a way to profit by themselves, but they see the university as a place for creating opportunities for the academics to go, to create new knowledge, to sell this knowledge and bring back the money to the university to create better infrastructure for research. This is the kind of issue that unify these people inside the universities, both at the public and the private sector. They are in favor of course, less control over the university. They are in favor of, this is very interesting, they are in favor of weak central authorities inside the university. They see the university as a kind of republic of scientists. So if it's a republic of scientists, the minimal government is a good alternative inside the university. All unities should be left to themselves to explore new opportunities, new alternatives, new possibilities for producing new knowledge, and also to explore new ways of financing research and things like that. And they are in favor of academic merit. I think that these three big coalition of interests are those that create the main dynamics inside the Brazilian university. And with this, I finish.
Thank you. Now, I'm calling Dr. Kinjal Ahi and Dr. Ashworth Peyer. Dr. Ahi is Senior Lecturer in Tolani Institute of Management Studies, Adipur, Kashif, Gujarat. Areas of interest are comparative studies on international and Indian higher education system, with a special focus on financing, equity, efficiency, and quality aspects of higher education systems, communication skills, and personality development. She won the Best Paper Award for the paper entitled Role of Higher Education in Sustainable Development, a case study of Gandhidham Taluka in the International Conference on Education for Sustainable Development organized by AIAER at Adipur, Kutch, as on in 2007. Dr. Priya is currently director and professor in management at Utrecht Business School, India. He has published widely in national and international journals. His areas of interest are higher education and innovation. So I give the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ashutosh. As again, we are representing India here for this particular topic, the stakeholders. So I will continue with the presentation that was made by Professor Kishore, because he has presented a complete photograph of the Indian education system, higher education system especially. But again, no system is the perfect system. You can't say that this is a perfect model. We have to have a research. We have to have a policy of development, because you cannot say that yes, India is a perfect model, or Brazil is a perfect model, Norway is a perfect model, Netherlands is a perfect model. Because change is always there. So every time the things will change, and you have to have a different kind of model to cope up with the particular situation. Here we are trying to introduction type, the pre-independence in India, the higher education, especially when we talk about the funding of the higher education by philanthropy and the private funding. But post-independence, the government funding was there. And mostly, the institutions in higher education, they were controlled by the government authorities. But the situation have changed when our government has started the economic reform in 1990s, and after that, the public sector and the private sector are equally operating in the Indian economy. Now we have divided all stakeholders of the higher education in Indian economy in the three parts especially, that is regulators, providers, and beneficiaries. Regulators, governmental organizations comprising of ministries and the departments at both central and state levels. Providers, public institutions deemed to be private institutions, international higher school institutions, and related organizations. Beneficiary, lot of beneficiaries are there. Society and nation at large, parents, the customers, students, the users, the job market, teachers, entrepreneurs, etc., etc. And an entire ecosystem, tutors, higher education consultants, agents, media, publishers, and the recently civil society groups. So all these are the stakeholders. And now, in India, the problem is everywhere. You can say that in regulators also, in providers also, even in beneficiaries also. The question is that, why higher education? Whether we are discussing this particular topic to establish good research universities, or to create the people who are post-graduated, they are having more PhDs, they are having more degrees, undergraduate degrees, postgraduate degrees. So we have to have an idea, we have to decide that yes, we are making a policy for this particular purpose. In India, regulators, many regulatory bodies. The apex body is MHRD, Ministry of Human Resource Development, state and central government, the central governments. But under this, a lot of agencies are there like AICTE, Medical Council, the Law Council. A lot of bodies are there. They are trying to regulate whole education system. The central universities 7%, state universities 47%, private universities 16%, deemed to be university 20%, institute of national importance and the institute under Legislature Act 10%. So the system in which what we are doing, that we are having central universities funded by the central government, the state universities funded by the state governments, private universities. Now the number is increasing. We will show the picture again. In India, regulators are responsible to provide the finance, guidelines, and the legal framework. Finance, which is a main concern for the research universities, whether we are getting the enough fund or not. This is a big concern there, that the public universities even, the state universities even, they are not getting enough fund for conducting the good research. Second, the guidelines, again, autonomy. When we have started with the private sector, a lot of institutes are coming up. Even we will show a table after this slide, that a lot of private institutes are there. As Professor Elizabeth was saying, that is an evil in this Brazilian system. But what we can say, and what we would say, that in India, private sector is doing really good. Maybe in professional education only. But again, the employability, whether we are creating the people to create the employability in the system, whether we are trying to establish a research university, you have to decide about it. Then the policy will be more effective. Trend is encouraging, which is evident from the growth of number of colleges and the enrollment. We are able to create more and more access to higher education. At least in India, we are creating the capacity. Lot of spaces are there. We are able to give the chance to the people that they can join the different courses, maybe undergraduate, maybe postgraduate. Now, providers. Public provisions of higher education, private provisions of higher education, and other providers. Public provisions, state government share is 3/4 and central government share is 1/4. If we talk about the central government, they are contributing 1/4 share, and the state governments are contributing 3/4 of the share. Of state share, 85% is spent on administrative and maintenance expenditures and 50% on capacity creation. That was the big problem. Due to that, we have introduced the private sector. Government budgetary expenditure on higher education as a percentage of GDP around 1.2%. Share of higher education in the total budgetary expenditure on education is 11.8%. But in public provision, the concern in governance, the main concern is governance, that they are not properly governed. They are not able to manage their show in an effective manner, and that is why the private people, they are coming up and they are giving an effective education, an efficient education. They are creating employability, because again, when we are talking about the industry university interaction or the industry institute interaction, in India, industry wants the good people who can manage the show. So they are very much interested to create the employability. They want good people, and this private sector is creating good people for the industry. Now, private provisions, private colleges, 3/4 of the total colleges in India. Aided college, unaided colleges. Aided colleges are the colleges where we will take the grant from the university. Unaided college, they are not taking the grant from the government. They are self-financed, totally run on the basis of the fee we are collecting from the students, or the research, or the consultancy, or the management development programs, or any other activity. Private higher education institutes as a percentage of total, 63%. Private higher education enrollments as a percentage of total is 52%. Now here, government is also trying to create the indirect aid to these unaided colleges also. As Professor Kishore was saying, that there are some sectors, some castes are there. These are backward castes. Also, the economically backward people. What government is doing, that yes, 50% of seats or some seats are reserved for that category, and if person is not able to pay the fee, the government will finance that particular fee to the institute. The institute will get indirectly in the term of fee that particular finance for the running the show. But it is not for the research again. This we have taken from the Pawan Agrawal's research that yes, the government universities, public financing, number of institutes 240, number of students like this, not growing. The public universities not growing. Private universities, 7, emerging. The data of 2006, now the situation is very much different in 2010. Deemed universities, aided, growing slowly. Deemed universities, unaided, growing slowly. College under government, not growing. The private colleges, aided, not growing. And private college, unaided, growing rapidly. So this particular figure shows that private sector is playing a very important role in Indian higher education. Mostly the private sector universities, whether they are aided or unaided, they are growing. So it's very difficult to compare two situations. As we are saying in the Brazil, you will find out that the private sector is not doing good. But here in India, the capacity creation through private sector, and now every private sector institution, they are trying to grow, and the results are positive. Now, gross enrollment ratio is 15%, about 17 million enrollment. So the students, higher education benefits an individual himself, his family, employer, society, and the nation, influences lifestyles, customer preferences, and challenges unacceptable social taboos in the society, treated as a tool of societal upliftment. In India, again, as we were discussing the Professor Romello also, that whether we are creating the research university or the good research institutions, but the objective is different, entirely different what the regulators are doing. They are trying to create the capacity, and with the help of that, again, the politicians, that they are trying to create their strength also in the system. Yes, we are creating more capacity, we are doing good, we are financing the students in the terms of fee, so they will understand that the government is doing for their, in their favor. So all these things, but again, what we are finding out that a tool of societal upliftment is there, that students are coming for the higher education, they're trying to get the degree, maybe they are having some societal, some you can say the status in the society. Yes, they are having the degree, they are understanding something, they are not like as somebody was saying here, that they are not they are leaving the education. This is not the question in India. We are trying to provide the education, even our higher education, to all our students, even all the people who are eligible to get the education. Again, the GER is 15%, it's very less. Number is increasing, but the overall average is very low. But number is, this is the general course account for 81% of total students. That's arts decreasing, science, commerce, education. When we talk about engineering, medicine, law, others, that they are increasing. So what we can say in the private sector, mostly the professional courses, the registrations are more, the students are taking more admissions, and they are creating more interest in these professional courses. The problem is that if we talk about the developing countries, the people, they would like to earn money. And how they will earn the money? Because if they are creating employability. People are employable in the good companies, they are offering their jobs, and the result is that we are getting more students in the professional courses. Beneficiaries and their roles, students, private rates of return on education at graduate level 15.87%, students pursuing higher education at various levels, graduation 86%, post-graduation 12%, research 1%, and the vocational courses 1%. So there is a great concern here that we are having research 1% and the vocational courses 1% again, that people are not taking the interest in the research activities and the vocational courses. Other beneficiaries include parents, employers, education, entrepreneurs, teachers, etc. Students' unions, again, it is playing a negative role in the system, and the political and the non-political in nature. Sometimes they are having non-political issue, sometimes they are having the political issue. So they are creating a negative impact on the system. So as studied Peter was saying, that implementation is poor in the India. So that implementation part, yes, we are lacking on the implementation part. The governance is poor, or sometimes we are not able to, you can say that, transform that particular thing in the reality. On paper, theory is very good, but the practical results, we are not getting that much that we should get. So now, external studies.
Thank you, Dr. Ashutosh. Completing the 4 segments of the stakeholders, the last one being external stakeholders and their role. Now, these are out of the system, but surely very influential. Minute characters there in the higher education system, but let's see how do they play the role. Like the tutors in the coaching classes. So once you're a part of the education system, even the primary education, you start going for coaching. And then there's the mindset that you've got to go for coaching. And then once you are there for the undergraduate level also, and when you're there for a coaching, which is outside the traditional higher education system, the tutor becomes the opinion leader. Now that's where a very small stakeholder, but he becomes a very influential person in terms of influencing the decision, even the very small decision like which institute should I join, he'll go to the tutor and ask, because there's that affiliation with him, the closer one. Publishers is very obvious. See, we need to understand one small little thing here. We say 15%, maybe the lowest of even the BRIC nations, but we are huge. 15%, when you even add 0.5% to it, it actually turns out to be millions of people we are talking about. And so the volume is huge. So in that context, publishers, even if you assign one particular book from a publisher as a textbook, you're saying it's into that many millions of textbooks being published. So publishers are coming up as a very crucial stakeholder here. Even the research being one of the very important criteria of upward movement in a career of a faculty, that publication of the research papers is also coming up very frequent. Media plays dual role, one as a whistleblower. If there's something wrong going on in the higher education system, they blow the whistle saying that, okay, there's something wrong going here. The best part in India, the media is allowed the freedom of speech. They can actually go and speak against the government outrightly in the public. And so that's the best part here. They act as a whistleblower in the higher education system. The second role, because media is a mass communication, so whenever you want to communicate something related to higher education to the mass of the people, you use the media again. So dual role played by media here. Social networking, it's everywhere. And I just read it in the ET some days ago that probably Facebook is now as big as India by population. So that holds true here. In India, you use it for your promotion. So that you've got your own Facebook page to promote your institute. You can go about accessing the details of the higher education institutes on the social networking, so it's picking up. Civil societies is very, very recent and an amazing role that they play. They are again fighting against the corruption, and we've all heard it everywhere about in India. We need to understand, higher education system at the helm of all the affairs is the ministry. And civil society is fighting against the corruption in the political arena at the ministerial level. So obviously, every Tom, Dick, and Harry is get affected in the political system. Obviously, higher education ministers and the ministry also being a part of it. So we can be hopeful of some corruptions-related issues in higher education to take some different angle, courtesy civil societies. Particularly higher education and the social pact. My friend already mentioned that how was regulation strong. Now this is interesting. Pawan Agarwal's paper mentions 15 different institutes, and surprisingly, the role that overlaps across those 15 institutes. They regulate almost everything. Whether or not the institute would start, the fees, the infrastructural requirements, student intakes, syllabus content, that's a bit problematic. We discuss it later. Evaluation, accreditation, faculty appointments, and honorarium, everything is regulated. So you just cannot be a free bird there, at least in the public higher education system. Their roles are overlapping is bothersome. Higher education is politicized, and as ma'am also mentioned for Brazilian case, judicial interventions at times work in favor or in against the very purpose or the objective for which higher education would have been working for. So that's obviously a big issue. Some positive things happening here. National Knowledge Committee, there were 2 very high level committee reports submitted in India regarding Indian higher education, one of which being National Knowledge Commission suggested we need to come out with one single apex body, removing all the existing, overlapping higher education regulatory bodies. And the best part that he suggested, this particular apex body would only and only report to the parliament straight. So you don't want any political interference in between in their acting of the role that they need to do. So that's something we should really look forward to, and time would say how well does it proceed. Educational Tribunal Bill should solve, this bill would suggest that if there are some judicial issues between two stakeholders of higher education, they would separately be dealt with through this bill and more quickly to be dealt with. As mentioned in the morning by Joshi sir, demand-supply gap is ever increasing. There's this escalating population belonging to the relevant age cohort. We know India is a young country, 60% of the youth population. And the number of students enrolled in secondary education is also high. So that passes on, unlike in the Brazilian case. It completely passes on to the higher education system. And so logically that it's so tough to cope up with meeting their requirements. Government lacks funding for higher education because it's obvious, I guess, for a developing nation, because we are developing, there are more prioritized needs. We're still worried about poverty, healthcare, primary education, and then probably they might be able to think over for higher education as well. So there are just different priorities at present, because of which you're only able to devote a very meager amount for higher education. Not for profit on papers, but they are actually for profit. Sir mentioned it. Quality concerns. The objective in this case, obviously, we are going for massification, but we have to accept, as Sir said, rightly the role. We can first think of providing the access, then you can talk of quality. So probably we are still at that stage that when quality will still, at some later stage, take over the role. And those for the existing ones, yes, the situation is a bit miserable. There are results and quality concerns. Very few institutes are actually accredited by the accreditation organizations. As Sir mentioned, unfortunately, so what do you do if you get an A grade? Or what do you do if you just manage with a C grade? It hardly affects you. What it's just done, it's a stamp on you that you got this grade. Nothing further. So that's an issue. Re-accreditation is not bothered with. So the system says that for a particular year duration you're accredited, after that you have to re-accredit yourself. That's not happening much. Efficiency concerns, syllabus designing is courtesy, bureaucracy, lethargic, that it's not very well upgraded, and that's where is signaled through the 5 minutes? That's great, thank you. That's where it's signaled through unemployment figures that were so rightly mentioned. It results into educated unemployed. A large share of research comes from only public institutions. Private you cannot expect, because these have become literally only teaching shops. Maybe doing those, that purpose might be better solved, but they are necessarily teaching shops. You cannot. Education is politicized. Market influences, which is very clearly signaled through higher enrollment in engineering and management. Philanthropy, as was mentioned, it was initially pre-independence very well done, but post-independence now, there's still some philanthropy happening, but with a very different objective. There's a tax-saving part there, which influences the philanthropy. Alumni can play a very crucial role in terms of syllabus designing, evaluation designing, donations, but the time has yet not come for that. Corporates, it's picking up. The industry institute linkages, we've probably started understanding that we cannot afford to remain away from this. Teachers as providers are in a bad state, as mentioned there. I love the statement by Adam Smith, so very well suited here, that no one, barring exceptions, works for the pleasure of it. Same is the case for faculties here. For students, it is an experience good, so you first pay the fees, then you understand for what have you paid the fees. By that time, it's too late. Unfortunately, the asymmetric information regarding the higher education institutes and the quality creates concerns further. All in all, many challenges, but the processes for improvements are augmented and efforts are praiseworthy in context of the huge size of higher education system in India. Thank you.
You will be the fourth one. No. Well, you can go first if you want. Wei Yang is associate professor, the Faculty of Education, University of Hong Kong. His research interests are comparative and cross-cultural analysis of educational issues, globalization, internationalization and educational reforms, social policy studies in education, educational development in Asia-Pacific countries, higher education reforms, international politics in education research, Chinese educational traditions and their modern transformations. So I give the floor.
Okay. By this time, I think most of you are very tired. Hopefully.
An emergency.
Oh, emergency.
Not an emergency. There's a coffee break. And so perhaps we are going to.
I was right. Everybody tired now.
Yeah. So we'll pause for 10 minutes for the 10-15 minutes for coffee, and then we'll restart with Professor Rui and Pili. Okay.
Yeah.
Where is she? Ah.
She just. Oh, yes.
She's there. It's a real emergency.
No, fine. It's good. It's good. People have a break.
Hello. I will ask everyone to take their places. We are restarting this second session. I want to make an announcement for those who are enrolled in this conference to receive a certificate, that the certificates are ready already, and they are available at the entrance. Então, os certificados de participação já se encontram aqui na entrada para aqueles que estão inscritos no curso. So, then I'll present again Dr. Rui Yang. He's associate professor with the Faculty of Education, the University of Hong Kong. His research interests are comparative and cross-cultural analysis of educational issues, globalization, internationalization, and educational reforms, social policy studies in education, education development in Asia-Pacific countries, higher education reforms, international politics in educational research, Chinese educational traditions and their modern transformation. So you have the floor.
Thank you. You all had a break. During the break, I had a very brief conversation with, where is she? No, she's not here. Oh, she's there. Excuse me, I forgot the pronunciation. Bernadette, yeah. And she said, okay, microphone, okay. She said everything changes so dramatically. I guess you meant, China is rising so dramatically to some extent. Let me from the very beginning, entertain you a little bit. China, in Chinese characters, means Zhonghua, the name. Zhong means in the middle, or middle. Hua is a flower. China, actually, according to the Chinese name, is a flower in the middle of the world. That really was, or to some extent still is, Chinese people's mentality. We are at the center of the world. And that was more the mentality hundreds of years ago. So China's rise in Chinese people's eyes perceived really differently. This is important, I think, when we try to understand how Chinese people do things and how Chinese people see this. And this has huge impact, in my eyes, on policy making and also on the parents and students and university academics. But it's something I call Sinocentrism, because China was relatively a center in that region at least, if not globally. By early Qing dynasty, China's GDP is almost like 1/3 of world GDP. And so China's rise, again, in Chinese people's eyes, is coming back again, rather than suddenly become a new rich the mentality. However, it's important, it would be extremely important to see how Chinese people interact with Brazilians, for example. You know why? Because for a long time, the Chinese people see themselves as the center of the world. They call other people barbarian, right? And the barbarian, the word created by the Greek, and they had a similar mentality, of course. But starting from Qing dynasty, late Qing dynasty, China suffered. China experienced unprecedented in the Chinese history humiliation, and the whole nation looted by Western powers. And therefore, the Chinese people see the Western world they have very complex, mixed feeling about so-called Western world. And just brief, in daily language, we do have tu means domestic, local. Yang means foreign. If they say, your dress is so tu, that's ugly. If your dress is so young, that means foreign, it's so beautiful. So Western knowledge, Western culture, and Chinese knowledge and Chinese culture have been competing for dominance, hegemony, for a long, long time. By far, only the Western is the winner. So the West, like many other parts of the world, the West has come to China with a huge prestige until now. So an ordinary Chinese people, not only ordinary, even some national leaders, when they individually interact with the other, particularly Westerners, they don't know. Sometimes they are almost like a master. That's mentality. Chinese centrism, Sinocentrism. That's we are civilized. You are barbarian. Sometimes just the opposite, because of the recent humiliation. So they don't know how to behave. Sometimes they're suddenly master. Sometimes they're suddenly slave. And when they interact with, including some fairly important national figures, they do this. Except those who have living or study, experience, substantial experience in the West, then they know much better how to behave this. Would be extremely interesting to see how the Chinese interact with the Brazilian people, because how they classify Brazil. Is it West or not? I don't know. Not so sure. Okay, would be interesting to observe. Anyway, let me come back to my topic. I was given this topic. To some extent, I was given this topic. When I had this topic, I was thinking, stakeholders. When we talk about stakeholders, we talk about losers and winners. And there are at least two ways to look at it. That's my understanding. I realized, after listening to you, I realized yours are actually far better. And two ways, at least, to look at the stakeholders. One is the changing relationship. Who are create new winners are not always the winners. Sometimes they become losers. And depend on the political change, depend on other changes. And another way to look at, most people, if you look at the literature, more people look at the losses and wins and gains of those certain kind of stakeholders. I will focus more on the former, that is more macro level, but with some part on the latter. So I will talk about the changes, the changing roles of winners and losers. These are not important. Just want to say equity is an important issue. and internationally, and Chinese government professes its strong commitment to this. It's written in the law, particularly recently. I also want to mention this because these are all factors, important factors, influencing Chinese way of governance today. And because of the change of governance, the changing modes of governance, so constantly they create different winners and losers. And globalization is changing China's policy making. And okay, this. I don't have to come here, okay. Is this the second? Yeah. Previously, I just mentioned China, was past at least 200 or 300 history. But if you look at contemporary, we will focus on the contemporary when we talk about losers and winners, higher education. But I have to start with Chairman Mao's period. Chairman Mao has been fairly influential in this part of the region. I don't know whether Chairman Mao has been well perceived positively or negatively, but Chairman Mao is influential in Latin America. And is still influential. And Chairman Mao was, of course, Chairman Mao controlled much of China during that period of time. And Chairman Mao's policy was very much based on his personal views and values. And he, compared to later leaders like Deng Xiaoping, he was far more idealistic. He was also very influential, of course, but far more idealistic. And his education policy very much based on his own ideology. And his ideology very often very ideal. And he always fighted for the poor, the grassroots, the peasants, the masses. And to some extent, my family was a victim. My family was sent to the countryside. I was born in the countryside. When I was very little, I saw how my parents and grandparents suffer from this political struggle. But during that period, a lot of the most important, the first political priority is political struggle, class line, that kind of stuff. I don't want to go into details of those, but that had huge impact on education, the winners and losers. Who were at that time winners? People, entrance examination, that's called workers, peasants, soldiers. Workers, peasants, soldiers. You don't have to have good education or examination scores. If you are real workers, they divided people into laboring people and non-laboring people. If you were not laboring people, you were punished. You were denied your education rights. So only those poor people, only those from countryside and those laboring people enjoy this education right. Just briefly, just quickly. And that was not fair, certainly, because if you are from an intellectual family, your higher education access denied. If you are from so-called rich family or bourgeoisie, then you have problem. The many story about this educational revolution. In Chairman Mao's eyes, those old education was, in his eyes, reactionary, against the people's will. So I just want to emphasize that was not fair, although Chairman Mao spent so much time and at the expense of the nation, actually, to favor those poor. The second one, another thing I want to emphasize is in Chinese tradition, in the Chinese long tradition of history, poor people never important, I think this is understandable in that kind of hierarchical society. Education, particularly high education, only belonged to the elite. And only recent, later I will cover this, only recent because of the massification of higher education, ordinary people can send their children to universities. On one hand, China has a long history. On the other hand, this is very, very recent. In fact, only a few decades, only 2 or maybe decades. But in Chairman Mao's period, for example, during Mao's period, look at these, workers and peasants were increased from that number percentage to this percentage. But that was, as I said, that was at the expense of the nation's interest. Paradigm change since the 1980s. I think the general picture is fairly clear. China moving gradually from the political struggle, from the class line, that kind of stuff, to economic development and reform and open door policy. Deng Xiaoping's famous theory was 先富, allow some people become rich first. That's obviously discrimination. Okay, this has, of course, huge implication for educational rights, higher education access. Policy arrangement from the reform period always China tried very, very hard. I don't say this is bad. This is actually good, and to some extent, in the interest of the nation, China's reform higher education reform always along the market line. What is market? Market could be blind and deaf. Market protects those with money, of course. So you can imagine the current period, those rich people, they benefit. Those, when I say rich, they're not really rich. They're just in Chinese society. Let me say this, something not exactly on this topic. When I come to Brazil, I spend 2 days on the way. I stay here 1.5 days, and then I go back 2 days on the way. But when I come on the way, see these people, because first time for me to come to Brazil, I travel to Europe, travel in Asia quite widely. You people enjoy very good high standard of living. The Chinese people know, even now, China is the second world economic power. Many Chinese people's life is still fairly, cannot compare with yours. I think this country, because of your population not so huge, and because of your resources, beautiful country, so people actually have fairly high living standard. China, no, China's situation is different. When I say those rich, it means those reasonably comfortable people in the Chinese society, middle class only, and the professionals. Pronounce the effect on the equality of education expenditure. China's policy education spending in proportion to GDP distributed very unevenly. This is between urban and area. Of course, because of along the market line, so those coastal areas, I think Professor Cai mentioned, those coastal areas and those eastern part of China became rich quickly. Western part, even today, now still far behind. Social effect of recent education reform. The most striking disparity is urban and rural. This is universal, of course. It's a global issue. But China is so striking and very evident. Look at the number. I have a few numbers here. Very interesting shape in China. Different social strata in Chinese higher education. The more prestigious the institutions are, the lower percentage of rural students. This is a far different picture from what we had during the Cultural Revolution. During the Cultural Revolution and immediately after the Cultural Revolution, usually half and half in the most prestigious universities in Tsinghua and Beida. Now, I think in Tsinghua, it's something like 17% from rural. That's only one part. I don't have the detail here. That's only one part. Another part is, if you are from rural area, even you are admitted to Beijing University, I'm not trying to attack Beijing University. If you are admitted, you study those subjects other people or rich people, they don't want to study. So you study, I don't want to say this is not important. You study anthropology, you study history, you study that kind of stuff. You don't study business or law or medicine. So also, even you are admitted, what do you study there? It's a huge, huge issue. The opportunities for peasants, I deliberately use the word to describe Chinese people. Those people, they are peasants, they are not farmers. And the opportunity for peasants to send their children to ordinary Chinese higher education institutions, look at these numbers. This is a little bit outdated. Now, the picture is actually even worse. Another study by Nanjing University people, and they said rural children are 5.6 times less likely to be admitted. And again, if you are admitted, what you study is another issue. And when you graduate, whether you can find a job, that's again another huge issue. Because if you have peasants' parents, it's very difficult for you to find a good job. If your dad is a governor, that's not an issue. I try to look at different policies. Again, Professor Cai mentioned these policies. Not all the same. We mentioned not all the same, but largely the same. I try to read, analyze, to some extent, discourse analysis of these policies and see what are the most important discourse. What are the themes ignored by them. Try to find winners and losers. And clearly, the documents demonstrate Chinese government's response to national needs, not necessarily peasants' needs. Global pressures on higher education sector dominated by significant themes identified by Chinese government, not other people, including international competition. They emphasize in their policy documents, they use this word again and again and again. Very important. International competition, socialist market economy, it's actually market. I read an article 3 days ago, just before I traveled. And they say, some people say Chinese market is actually more market-oriented than German market. They actually say Chinese is more capitalist, I think, than German. I do doubt whether Germany is a capitalist society. And knowledge, economy, human capital, and social construction. These seem, I need to explain a little bit. I don't use social construction. They very often use the word 小康社会, moderately prosperous society building. So that's based on the Chinese classics, but said by Deng Xiaoping. And these themes for the picture, for the scenario of the reform of Chinese higher education sector are very, very important. They form the theme, the discourse. They also demonstrate Chinese government's efforts to address problems of educational discrimination can be traced back to 1990s, but never really higher on the agenda. I mentioned later. Notions of equity in education first appeared in government in 2006. It's almost like Chinese economy. Just at the early stage of the reform, people say you cannot, because Europe was already developed, America was already developed, and they had a lot of lessons for China to learn. They say you cannot pollute your environment. And the Chinese people actually, they polluted the environment. If you go to China, the first impression is how polluted this place, I mean physically, air and environment. How polluted it is. They pollute first, and they try to address the pollution. Of course, at a huge cost. But it was for them, for the Chinese society, it was hugely risky if they try to find an alternative way of development. So they couldn't. It's much easier for them to use the current system and try to find a way to develop. So they pollute first, and then they try to address the issue. Did I make myself understood? And this is almost like the same. They will have this very unequal system, and now they gradually come back and try to address these issues. So you can see, 2006, they start to have this kind of policy. Before 2003, education equality values was basically missing in Chinese education policy making. Economic interest and discourse played a dominant role. Now still very dominant, but they do address equality issue. I don't want to read. Issues of education equity with social class and gender. This is not important. Because of the Chinese culture, perhaps, I'm not so sure, gender has never been high on the agenda of social equality. Social class, they don't mention this. In fact, previously they criticized other society. No class, no kind of difference. Actually, there's a huge difference now. But what they pay attention to is minority issue and disabled children. Usually they pay attention to these kind of issues. Foci of Chinese policy for educational inequality. Ethnic minority people. China has 57, right? 57 ethnicity, 5 minutes. I think I can finish, yeah. Education, they pay attention to minority issues and disabled. Most of the text were mainly located in Chinese basic education. Higher education, not very much emphasized. Texts about minority students and disabled students did not use the keyword as equality. About Chinese major policy documents. Okay, try to finish quickly. I just want to emphasize, it's really, if you look at the literature, it's far easy. It's actually misleading if you criticize, okay, Chinese government has ignored this disadvantaged group. That's just too easy to do. It's not entirely fair, for the government, to be honest. The issue is because of a variety of forces. But the way of Chinese I mentioned the Chinese, if there is a Chinese way of governance, and that governance really has a huge impact on educational inequality. And that governance, that mode, changes all the time. So therefore, each time it changes, it creates new winners and losers. That's my message. And of course, in terms of how to look at the Chinese mode of governance, we have debates. I think that's almost the end. I'll just cite this, conceptualize the Chinese governance, and I'll cite someone. Okay, just to end. During the past 6 decades of so-called socialist construction, higher education policy has experienced dramatic paradigm shifts in line with the nation's transformation. And priority in education policy has been shifted from equity to efficiency that is measured almost exclusively by financial money terms. As China's governance transformed from one to another mode, new winners and losers has been created, often with the former far outnumbered the latter. I think that's the end. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
You had 2 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Now I'm calling Piliwi Lowana. She is the director of the Education Policy Unit at the University of Witwatersrand. Previously, she was the chief executive officer of UMALUZI, the Council for Quality Assurance in General and Further Education Training, for 8 years. She has worked at all levels of education in South Africa and the United States of America. She has served in many commissions tasked with the transformation of education in the country. She serves in a number of associations, boards, and councils in education and training in South Africa, in Africa, and the Commonwealth. She consults for international education and training entities. She has published and presented papers on a number of issues in education and training, among which the further education and training, higher education interface in the context of the South Africa National Qualifications Framework. So you have the floor.
I want to start by reinforcing what has already been said by my colleague Katie about the South African higher education. What we consider as higher education in South Africa is university education. So that has got to be made quite clear. What we consider as higher education is mainly public education. We don't even talk about private education. We pretend it doesn't exist. It's very small. Thirdly, that our higher education is very homogeneous. It looks and behaves the same way because it is quite heavily steered by the state. So if we put those 3 things at the back of our mind, then we can talk about the role of stakeholders in this system. And what I've chosen to do is to track the changing role of stakeholders in education instead of describing what they do, because it has been changing as we have been changing as a society. We always say that transformation in South Africa is a national sport. Americans would say, why fix it if it ain't break? But we always, if you cannot fix something, there's no reason for you to exist. We label you that you are counter-revolutionary, you are non-progressive, you are this. If you are a useful member of society, you must find something to change. So it is in that context that you know that we always are working on a very moving target in as far as higher education. This is my presentation outline, but don't be worried, it's exactly 7 slides. To start with, what I am going to be doing is to talk about how higher education has also, as a subsector of society, as a subsector of education, has been preoccupied with this national question. Transformation is a national question in South Africa, because somewhere along the line, we have been made to believe as South Africans that we can make anything that we can make. If we had changed South Africa to be what it is, anytime we want to change the country, anytime we want to change anything, we can change it. So it is within that context. But we also are a very, very optimistic society that we can always have a better future. So this paper explores those changes. And the question is transforming, what is the question of transformation in South Africa? Because it keeps on moving. And therefore, if it keeps on moving, do we take the same stakeholders as the people who are going to give us the solutions? And which ones have been marginalized along the ways? Which ones have resurfaced? So the paper will start by looking at the history, because our history definitely shapes what our present looks like at the moment. Right from the beginning, we had two white tribes that came to the country. One was coming from England, the other one was coming from the Dutch, from the Netherlands. These white tribes, they came, and the English one started to produce its own higher education system in Cape Town. At the same spot, the Dutch fought for some kind of space to create its own higher education system. So we started with two different kinds of higher education system, one following the Dutch system and with tradition and with the hegemony of the Afrikaner, one with the English. It was only in 1948, when the new Nationalist Party took over, that it had an idea that there are other people here whom we can create their universities. So the Nationalist Party created a race and ethnic-based higher education system. Down the line, there was an idea of homelands. And then again, the same Nationalist Party created a homeland-based higher education system. So you can see that we've been having a very highly differentiated higher education system, which had a rigid social order and occupational structure. Created in different localities, we speak about bush universities, because for the blacks, for those in the lower order, you will find the universities in the rural areas and not in the urban areas. Reinforcing a certain kind of social structure and inequality in terms of funding, in terms of courses that can be offered. Even up to date, there is not a single black university, historically disadvantaged university, that offers engineering courses. So we still have those, that differentiation. Came 1994, the magic year for South Africans, when we had Mandela and we were going to have a new government. One of the first things that the new government did was to establish a national commission for higher education. And in order to be able to reconstruct this terrain of education, to produce a new higher education system. The racially differentiated higher education was sitting with unease in relation to government, in relation to the different institutions, to a number of things. But it also was, there was a part of the system that was extremely adversarial to the state and was pushing for change in many different areas in the country. The first thing that we have to look at is how we started to reconstruct the stakeholders in South Africa, because we had a government, a state, that more or less in all these different types of institutions was interfering in one way or another. It was not steering, it was not supervising, but the extent of interference and the nature of interference differed, and these are being explained in the paper. So the first thing that the NCHE, one of the things that the National Commission on Higher Education recommended in the construction of this new system was a form of cooperative governance, because there was an acknowledgement that higher education cannot go on being governed only by the state. There must be other people who have got good ideas that are going to be able to promote a good and a progressive higher education system. One of the things that are important that we have to note was the creation of a Council for Higher Education, which was going to act as a buffer between the state and the institution, and was to play an advisory and policy-making role in higher education. The Council recommended major changes in terms of how university councils are going to have to be structured, with a balance of institutional and external holders, because you would find that most universities would go for business and people who are going to give them money, people who are more influential, and you find that in the local communities and many other stakeholders are not represented. Reformed senates and faculty boards, this is in fact a shorthand of a major reconstruction of making the university system to be relevant. Legislated institutional forum. This is one of the most important and interesting aspects, which I think is South African, uniquely South African establishment of institutional forums, where internal stakeholders would advise the institutions, would also advocate and would participate in the governance of institutions. And within these institutional forums, the strongest voices would come from unions. And when we're talking about unions, the strongest unions in the academia are for support services. People who clean, people who make tea, people who do gardens, people and so, and more than the academic unions. That was one stakeholder that has been quite strong. The second stakeholder that has been strong in the institutional forum is student councils, who had to be able to advocate for certain things. So these institutional forums were very, very strong at the beginning of our new higher education system. The NCHE advocated three major principles to move the system away from what it was. One was the principle of increased participation, because at that time, the participation was very, very low. And I will come back to that to say, have we improved or not? Increased participation, especially from Africans or black population, was very, very low, because the throughputs from the schooling system were extremely low. There was no financial support. So there had to be mechanisms that will be established in order to be able to support this principle. Secondly, increased cooperation and partnerships, because it was acknowledged that higher education cannot be governed by only just Big Brother. And also the institutions themselves cannot be just towers of ivories without having some inputs from society. And then thirdly, greater responsiveness. Let's start looking at the reconstruction of higher education and the role of stakeholders. First, we must put this in the context of what the country was experiencing at this time. Some of us, we believe that we only had a country that started in 1994. We prefer not to remember what happened before. But it's a country that became a product of a negotiated settlement, that enemies sat together and the whole wider society sat together to negotiate how the country is going to be like. That created a recipe for all kinds of formations and organizations to be able to take their differences and put them on the table so that they can come out with a solution that is going to please people. In that recipe, in that formula, there is bound to be a give and take. But out of that negotiated settlement, the first overarching outcome was one of reconstructing the country. And remember that this is a country that has been extremely devastated by the war of apartheid. The reconstruction and development of the country was important. That now is the time for the other people who have always been denied, and the resources are going to be put into these all areas that are going to develop the other areas of life. Then the reconstruction of higher education followed the same pattern, because we've seen it as a winning recipe, that you can sit down and negotiate, and the first priority is to reconstruct that you thought it was not working. But unfortunately, higher education doesn't operate as an island. It's affected by everything that goes around. So when the NCHE was constructing all these kind of stakeholders and elements and requirements for making higher education work, the reality was beginning to emerge about our fiscus, about what can be distributed, how much kind of money is there, and what is possible. And all of a sudden, we had a government that changed its overarching policy from reconstruction to saying, no, 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 no. We must grow the economy first and have what we call growth, employment, and redistribution. You can't start by redistributing that which you don't have. That had a major impact on how now the higher education institutions are going to organize themselves. Because remember that there were all these levels of structures that were going to direct, and there was this habit, this inherited habit of participating and debating and negotiating everything. Inasmuch that other people who have written between the time that the National Commission for Higher Education policies came out and to the time when the new government started to steer the system, are saying that this government had what is called policy symbolism. They were just legitimizing themselves because the same government had to make a kind of a somersault and turning around to make things to work. The second thing that came out right after a major policy change, right after the Commission of Higher Education, was the shape and size and shape policies that was going to define the contour of education. Remember that in spite of all these talks, the institutions were still racially divided. The institutions were still having their historical past. But what is important in the coming up of the size and shape policy, it didn't come from a wider policy participative forum. It came primarily from the Council on Higher Education, which was set up to advise the government, the minister, about higher education. So that was the major shift, when there was expectation all along that whenever the government is going to change something, it's going to start to go to the people. But the government said, no, 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 no. I'm going to tell you what I want to change, and this is how we're going to change. It changed the nature of what had to happen inside the institutions themselves, because institutions had to fight. We had 36 institutions before. We had universities and what you call polytechnicons. We had colleges. We had different kinds of things. So what this system was saying is that we've got too many universities in this country for the population. We're going to cut them into 23. We're going to change all the polytechnicons and make them universities. Nobody knew, there were few universities that were guaranteed that they were not going to be cut off. So universities had now an internal looking because they were fighting for their own turf. Instead of stakeholders now trying to solve the problems of the country, they had to look at what's going to happen to us. How best can we position our institution? But at the same time, because the microeconomics of the country have changed, the government was all of a sudden emphasizing efficiency, growth, and all kinds of cuts that going to be possible. That trickled down into the institutional level, because the institutions now have had to be efficient in terms of how they had to manage their resources. As a result, a new style of governance in the University of Management, of managerialism, came up. The one that is looking towards the private corporations. I always say that when I go to some of the universities that I am a council member, they have scorecards on measuring things. All the things that have been foreign in public institutions, because this is what private corporations do. So there was this kind of managerialism. A few elite people in the institutions would be managing the institution. And many people would be saying that the institutions, it depended on who is the vice chancellor, the direction, where the direction is going to go. Institutions were measured against their performance. This managerialism affected the institutional forum. Remember that we talked about as one of the most important categories of very, very low, mainly low-level people in the universities who were participating. It affected them because they had no place, they had no role, they had no voice in terms of what was going on in the university. And the different institutions reacted differently. There were those who were strong in coming up with managerialism, because this is a system now that all of a sudden is requiring a lot of reporting, in order to be able to get money, you need to be able to produce this in order to be able to do this. So you had to have an army of people, engine people, who are managing all the kinds of things that government is requiring. There are institutions that reacted well, but there are institutions who played, and most of those who reacted well in terms of managerialism are coming from the Dutch or African-speaking tradition. The English-speaking coming from a very much more autonomous, playing to their academic strength. They continue to play to that strength. And there was this group of institutions, mainly the historically disadvantaged, that continue to flounder. And in particular, those universities who were previously polytechnicons, who now had moved into the space of being universities. So in spite of all the ambitions we had, it has been clear to everybody that a differentiated sector was emerging as institutions were responding differently. Differentiation in higher education has, and to a large extent, is always a swear word. Just like if you are not transforming anything, you must be dead. But you cannot easily talk about differentiation because of the past that we're coming from, and all these kind of different systems, because people keep on saying, you can't take us back. We want everybody to be treated the same. We want all institutions to be funded the same, et cetera, et cetera. But whilst all this has been happening, different stakeholders began to disengage because the role of stakeholders was beginning not to be as clear as it was during the beginning of the transformation process. And in particular, the institutional forums. And in fact, many people are still asking whether we still need those. In spite of all this, transformation is still a national question, okay? It's still a national question in South Africa. Because it's a question of whether the glass is half full or half empty. I know that my colleague was saying that we are not being able to get high numbers. In my previous life, I was working for the schooling system. I know that we have produced in the schooling system, we've improved magically in terms of the numbers of students that we can produce. In 1998, in 1999, 1996, 7, and 8, we produced only about 45, 46% of people who passed our high school diploma. Out of those, only about 12 to 13% could go to university. We are in a different place now. There have been improved participation rates. Universities have been deracialized because you have got to say how far can you be able to do that. Most of the problems that we have in our higher education in terms of not being able to bump up the numbers has got to do with the number of institutions that we consider to be higher education. We have a very small higher education sector for our population if we only consider universities. If we would open up and space for higher education institutions, we would be able to accommodate more students. There has been an improved relationship of state with institutions, but it's not quite cooperative, but it's not as adversarial as it was. And within the institution, there's some kind of acceptance of management, but also strong checks and balances. One thing that I didn't say is the change of the role of the Council for Higher Education, which I mentioned in the paper. It is the body that was made to be an advisory to the state about what needs to happen. We see that role receding as well, that it is merely playing the role of regulatory, looking at quality checks, not necessarily advisory. The one area that higher education in South Africa has been difficult to crack is it's about responsiveness. And the question is whether the system can be responsive if it is a non-differentiated system, as we want it to be. Don't we need different kind of institutions to do different things, first of all? Secondly, it's about the role of producing knowledge in that society. And I think that is going to be talked about because we keep on talking about, are we going to enter the second wave of industrialization as a society? If so, what is going to be the role of higher education in doing that? Can we be able to crack the manufacturing? Do we have enough population to be able to self-sustain that manufacturing sector? What are we going to do with our social problems, and what is the role of higher education? They all point out to two things of whether or not the institutions are going to do the same thing. Secondly, whether or not we are going to be able to reconfigure what the role and purpose of higher education. So, at the end, I want to say that there has been a changing role of who the stakeholders and how they've come into the play of higher education. The participatory model that was proposed at the beginning of transformation was mirroring what was happening in the country. But as part of a larger society, we've seen some retraction of the prominent role of some of the stakeholders. There are recent issues for transformation which include differentiation and responsiveness. And the question is, who are the stakeholders who would need to take that up? Because higher education has been seen mainly stakeholders as civil society. And my view is that it's high time that the academics raise up to be able to configure how these institutions are going to play a meaningful role. Having said that, though, South Africa still remains one of the most active deliberate democracy. We still talk ourselves to death about each and everything because we think that we can change everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, we have about 1 hour for questions and comments, because well, we'll have to leave the place by... I mean, yes, please. So, we're taking questions from the floor.
Well, I think we saw a big, broad picture of quite different systems and issues related to stakeholders. And on the side, I think China has a very special characteristic that most, as expected from the political system, is mostly state-driven system with a very strong national interest directing all the actions, either in the Mao's era or in present since Deng Xiaoping reforms. But I think one thing there that is really relevant was that you made very clear was this idea of a zero-sum game. I got this impression when you talk about losers and winners, that the impression is that since you have some restrictions of resources, either you go in one direction and then some people will get it and will be involved and will be included in the educational system, especially in the higher education, or another group, depending on this view as the state is seeing as the needs of the country. And but of course, the system is expanding. We know that. Now I think it's between 25 or 30 million students. So I think that there is a change, and even though there is some concentration on some groups and some people being included or not, and that's but still the system is growing. So there is some dynamics in terms of more and more people being included, and then certainly the idea of that you have an elite system in some areas and then you expand that. The crucial thing, as we've seen in Brazil and some other areas where we have gone from the elite system to a very large system, is how to keep quality. And so the issue then comes to Brazil, which we saw the quality now is not a government issue anymore, is a productive system, the industry system. So there are these two things. The quality issue, I think, is one of the things that, even though it's usually dealt with by regulatory or regulation or assessment systems, but actually when it becomes part of the broader society, especially the outside stakeholders issue, then is where it probably will become more relevant. So, and then in India and South Africa, I just want to comment and then make a question for all of you, is in India, I still didn't get, so I see a much more complex thing. So I couldn't detect clearly what were the main, what are the strongest stakeholder, what area is actually driving the system, and if it, so I see a very complex system. And in South Africa, clearly the issue is the issue of equality, the transition from the apartheid to the democratic system, and which is also important in Brazil, of equity and social groups. So the question is this: is it possible to establish some quality assessment system which is related to each particular system, in particular stage of development of the systems in the societies. How do you do that? Is it true that the state usually is not a very good quality controller or quality assessment system, and that it only when the society at large is more involved with the issue of quality and support for higher education that you really see change? So this, how the stakeholder, so the internal stakeholder, we know much better what they are. The question is, what are the outside stakeholders? Is that an issue of government, or is that an issue of the society at large? What are the main players there? What do you think in each of your country are the main players in?
In the case of South Africa, I think it's implicit. I mean, you mentioned, at the end you mentioned, well, the academics should be more important, but just it was a phrase about the academics. Where are the academics throughout all this whole history? And so what are the role of the political parties, of the National Congress and the social movements and what the students and the business sector? I know that there are problems of people going to study abroad or how the process of bringing together the universities, integrating them, is shaping up, or how different groups are reacting to that. So I think all these issues are present in South Africa. And your presentation, all this is there, but it probably should be more explicit, at least for someone from outside. These are my main observations.
I was expecting a bit more on the role of the student union in transformation of higher education in different countries. So if all of you can highlight, what has been the role of student union as a prominent stakeholder, in transforming the higher education system in the respective country, that would be good.
Peter, you have a question?
Thank you. Thank you for the presentations and the very detailed and informative discussions, reflections, analysis of stakeholders. Now, what is of interest to me is to get a better understanding of the institution that we are talking about here, higher education. Because we've been informed about policy processes and changing targets in policy processes, about political constellations that have been changing, about the transformations taking place in South African society. And we've been informed about reconstruction of the role of higher education from the perspective of stakeholders. But what in the last 10, 15 years is the kind of template that within the political context in your countries where these transformations have been taking place and where the BRICS countries have emerged as countries that are part of the dominating world order, what kind of template of higher education and of the university is emerging within the stakeholder constellations? What kind of university or higher education institution or system is expected to contribute to the kind of society and the kind of socio-economic model that these new political constellations try to stimulate? I mean, Elizabeth reflected upon it. But it would be good if we could have an insight into how, within the context that you described, the BRICS countries develop a vision on higher education. Whether there is a vision at all is of interest to know, and whether it's a new vision or just a variation of the template that's 900 years old.
Well, just a little compliment on Simon's question on China. I don't see the part of the society as a stakeholder, but when you look at the government, when you look at the government of the economy, there are a number of stakeholders that are very influential in the government and the economy. I mean, what the literature calls the reformist inside the government and the new left inside the government. And, well, the banking system and the state-owned enterprises and the international enterprises, they have a say on the economy and on the government. Don't they have a say on the university too?
Yeah. Before I answer questions, let me mention Simon's question. You are right. You are fair. That was a fair question. I didn't go into detail about what kind of losses or what kind of gains of different stakeholders. I should have, but as I said, I focus more on the changing landscape. And my paper, when I finish my paper, I will have the part specifically on who are the winner, who are the loser at different stages. Let me start from the first question. Whether or not, if I left you the impression that it is a zero-sum game, that is a wrong impression. That is something just the opposite to what I want to give to you. It's not zero-sum. It's the Chinese situation today. Let me just be brief. If you go to China, you ask people, "Are you happy?" That's today China Central TV asks the question to ordinary people, "Are you happy?" If you go to China and ask people, different ranks, all walks of life, "Are you happy?" Most of them, unlike what the CCTV has presented, actually they are not happy. They are all angry. But if you ask them whether they have gained, whether they want to go back to 25 years ago, everybody would say no. So everybody gains in China's contemporary reform. Nobody or very few people are happy because of the way the society has been governed. You see what I mean? The role played by the state is not always well perceived by its people. And however, we have to give Chinese state a lot of credit because the reform has been initiated by the state and implemented. That's exactly the problem. The policy makers, also policy implementers. That's the problem. Who assess them and who punish them? That's the problem. So that's basically the question, not zero sum. In terms of the Simon's question, I already mentioned. I will, if you are willing, I will send you my draft. Then we'll have detailed parts on who wins and who loses. The third question, institutions, I think. Is it? Or is it possible? Your question is it possible to have, to have government to assess quality? Was that your question? As I just said, the Chinese system is policymakers are also policy implementers. That's the problem. But however, I really want to say the Chinese government is the most qualified because of the strong state. Chinese situation is fundamentally different from many Western societies. So China's government is the most qualified agency to at least implement. But in my eyes, Chinese government needs to work with civil society, with the non-governmental organizations and institutions to ensure quality. Moving to the institution question. Institutions, in terms of winners and losers, is really, really interesting to observe because as I said, the Chinese government, Chinese state is so strong and so centralized system. So Chinese government always protect the institutions that they like. They handpicked a few institutions and label them as the best. They are not always the best, but they are labeled as the best, and they are hugely protected and invested. A lot of money directly from government. The Chinese government can directly, we all know the examples, invest hugely on a few universities and ignore others. So different periods, they have key national flagships identified by the government, not by the customers. And those are very often are the winners. And provincial institutions are often the losers. But within the provincial, this is a highly differentiated picture. Within the provincial government, institutions, you also have private institutions. Private institutions previously was even not recognized. now increasingly being justified, but still I think in a great disadvantaged position to compete with those protected by government. So it's generally very differentiated picture. Yeah, that's the...
I would like to start with the last question about the template for change in South African higher education. The template for change was set right from the beginning and had been couched in very noble concepts. Concepts of equity, development, quality, participation. But because the institutions themselves needed a whole lot of attention, in the first few years, in the first maybe 10, 15 years of the new order, there was no way that the issues around access and equity would not be prioritized. And in this area, we're talking about not only access of students who could not get into university, but also of staff, because most of these institutions, even the historically disadvantaged, the black universities, the staff were white, the administrators were white, so there had to be work that had to be done in terms of changing that whole milieu to reflect the complexion and also the structure and the nature of the country. And in fact, there is always some people say that you cannot be a vice-chancellor, which is the principal of a university in South Africa, if you are not black. But it's not the case. So there was a huge preoccupation of changing the internal dynamics. And in that, the role of students, the role of staff who felt very aggrieved, who could not be promoted, who could not progress, who were marginalized.
And they are getting even equal type of opportunity to say, yes, we want this, and we want this. So, but still as our colleague has described in a slide, that regulators' role is very wide. They are controlling the syllabi, they are controlling the fee, they are controlling the approval, they are controlling everything. So you can say the main stakeholder still is regulator in our country. And they are regulating the private institutions as well. The second question, as Dr. Kishore has said, that what is the role of a students' union? There are two examples in our country. If we talk about IIMs and IITs, some student groups are there, they are contributing very positively for the development of the institution, for the development of the content, for the development of the whole organization. But when we talk about the state universities and central universities, mostly the student unions are backed up by some political parties. And the political interest is main motto for these students' union. That's why the negative impact is much more higher than the positive one. So, no doubt, it's a student union is a very important stakeholder, but it depends upon that what is the motive behind it, whether they are driven by the political party or they are having some good intentions to do something good for the institution. That is very much important. So, no doubt, the students' unions can play a very important role, but it depends upon the situation and the culture and the environment in which they are working. Thank you. And then other two questions, I think Kunjal will take.
To begin with the quality aspects, we've got, though affiliated, we largely talk of only affiliated and the education institutes which are in the mainstream, which have a legal status for existence. For them, NAC is a wonderful, like in our opinion, it's really a good system of quality assessment of a higher education system. So if somebody would follow it perfectly, and no matter what grade would one have achieved in the first round, in the second round of re-accreditation, if they try to achieve from C grade to A grade, we can see some improvements. But the problem is more different than that. Accreditation, the system is perfect, but what do you do after that, after the accreditation? Right? If my institute's got, say, a C grade, there's no punishment on my institute. If I scored an A grade, there are no rewards either. So it just gets over with a tag on you. That's a bigger concern. So it has to be affiliated with performance evaluation, which is not happening, which is what I was trying to argue there. One, two, even those which are affiliated with NAAC, the ones getting C grades and all are hardly quality institutes. So once you've said that you're NAAC certified, does not assure any good quality still, unless you've got to check the grading. Those institutes, there are further some institutes which are not in the mainstream having a legal status, and they're still operating. Organizations like AICT is really trying hard to put up a list that to make aware the students. This is what I was mentioning with regards to asymmetric information problems that the students might face. Because they show a list on their website saying that these we do not affiliate. But then there has to be still enough marketability of that list to the student so that he goes to the list and checks that if I'm taking the admission here, whether or not it has a legal status. The marketability of the non-affiliated institute list may still need to be worked upon on the quality front. I can comment best that. Peter Sir's question, I'll look at it from the two angles. One was the change template. Over 6+ decades of our independence, the main upsurge that you start seeing is ever since we started talking about and implementing privatization. So I see that as the main template of change in the higher education, because once you allow the change in financing, there are the follow-ons on equity, efficiency, quality, access parameters. So ever since then, we saw an upsurge on access, quality vis-a-vis goodness or badness. Equity obviously remains a stronger concern now, but that's the positive or negative is the latter story, but change starts inducing since privatization, as I see. I again see one more aspect to your question, contribution to the society of education, higher education. I learned much of that from your from your presentation in the morning itself, and particularly of interest to the India. We're talking of superpowers. If India was to become a superpower, knowledge society has to be developed. I think we are beautifully placed as far as demographic dividend is concerned. We were so worried around 1.5, 2 decades ago if we were to treat population as a liability. But fortunately for us, if the privatization could assure enough access, we can convert, and we can now then proudly call population as rather a dividend than a liability, courtesy higher education, contributions to the youth's development. And that's how we see probably so much of growth to the economy coming from, these growths are coming from research and development, higher education dominated BPOs and IT and KPOs. So I think we can give a lot of right to higher education's contribution to that. And a very subtle best part of contribution to the society of higher education is it's a well-informed decision-making process by the youth. And how we could see this is when the recent Kejriwal civil society upsurge picks up, literally doctors and engineers, keeping aside their daily routine, they would go out in the streets and fight against the corruption. So a positive externality of higher education contributing to such a subtle thing as well. My suggestions.
Well, such a lot of questions. I would like to start with the question posed by Peter, because it created me a kind of puzzle. Because you are right, why the university as institution is not present in my presentation? And I think that this is linked toward cultural trait of the Brazilian, mostly the public universities, is that the strong centrifugal forces that are operating inside the public universities. What I mean by that is that for me, the universities in Brazil are strongly are a confederation of interests inside. It is very difficult for the university to act as a unique, as a unitarian actor. What we have is unions inside the university, research centers, groups inside the university. You have students, but it's very difficult to pick up what is the place of the university. I think that this is a problem for us. I think that this picture is changing. The high direction of the universities, especially in the public sector, are increasing their participation as an institution in the negotiations, but the capabilities are weak, especially because the huge part of the public universities in Brazil, which are the federal universities, they have very little financial autonomy. For instance, in the last semester, I was in charge of collecting information about academic career in Brazil. But for a research that was leading by CEAv and many other centers in Europe. And one thing that they asked was the salaries. What are the highest salary possible in each position of the career ladder? Well, you cannot imagine our hectares, our register, they were not able to say anything about that. They say now the minimum wage of an academic in this exposition is this. I said, oh, okay, but the average salary, I don't know. The highest salary possible, I don't know. Why? Because it's the Ministry of, I think, the planning that pay the salary of the academics. So the university doesn't know, they don't know the salaries of their people, their personnel. When the government said, oh, we are going to use this instrument to select the people, the university has autonomy, he can do it, or he can choose not to accept this instrument. But the university really doesn't have alternative other than accept the decisions made by the government, because the federal sector has very little autonomy in terms of financial budget process and things like that. It's very difficult for a university that not even know how much each of its own personnel have as a wage to have any kind of policy, for instance, personal policy and things like that. And of course, if you look at the universities of the state of São Paulo, they have more autonomy, so they have more financial autonomy. They are more institutionalized in this sense. They have a more proper profile. But even in this situation, I think that there are a strong autonomy of the groups, of the people inside the university. They made a lot of decisions, they react by their own, and not only the university as an institution. It's something more or less maybe a bit disconnected in this situation. Regarding the question of quality, I think the quality really is a big issue, and I think that Renato is correct. This nowadays is an issue for the society. This is the first time, I think, in higher education in Brazil that quality become an issue for society. I think that the first time it was it was posed as an issue for the society was in the government of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, when the first provão, the first examinations of the people that were leaving the university, the profile. We have developed a lot of very complex instruments for evaluating a university, the quality of the university, the colleges and everything else, the quality of this. But I think that in our case, these instruments are very much homogeneous in a sense that they evaluate with the same parameters universities like ours university that have a budget of more than $2 billion per year, almost $2 billion in the case of the University of São Paulo, and small, teeny, colleges that have 100, 200 students, you use almost the same parameters. You have this Frankenstein classification is provisional, but it's always are ranking all the institutions in Brazil, but then it's not fair to compare a university, a public university, a university with lots of money, with a very small for-profit institution that depends on the fees paid by the students to survive. I think that this is a problem that we should work. I think Maria Helena is going to address it much more. I think, well, I will finish here because it was too much question.
We have time for another couple of questions, and then go back to the speakers. Comments?
Do you expect the emerging economies and countries to develop a new system of higher education? Because you posed that question, nobody actually responded to that. Do you think there's an alternative models that haven't been developed yet? Do you envision something like that? Or the international community? Remember, I think that at least most of the universities, as we think of research, are built from people that travel a lot, that study in other places, and learn about higher education from living in universities that have been built during the 800 years that since they started. So, what do you can you think of an alternative, and maybe the people here can answer that?
Yes, thank you. The million-dollar question. No, it wasn't so much an assumption that a totally new model would develop, but the model that we have, it's not a 900-year-old model, because what we have is a model that was built on a German reinterpretation of an institution that was fading away at the end of the 18th century. And the Humboldt vision, together with some innovations in France, which were then later adapted and translated in the US, have brought us to where we are now, which in many ways, if you look at, especially at the US, but also at other countries, and we reflected upon, or I tried to reflect upon it a bit this morning, has, and we discussed that also yesterday, come in a number of respects to its end. It's too expensive. You can't have 100% participation rate in higher education in the traditional model because there's not a society in the world that can afford it. In addition, we've talked a lot about students and about education, and of course, that's the core function of higher education, but where does research fit in? And is it necessary? If you look at the Chinese vision from 10, 12 years ago, by 2020 we want to have 30 universities among the 100 best in the world. And then they found out no one could tell them what are the 100 best universities in the world. And that was one of the drivers behind the Shanghai ranking. But that's a research-based ranking, and the Chinese universities are still, there's not one university from mainland China outside Hong Kong among the 100 best in the Shanghai ranking. And still, the economy of China isn't dependent, apparently, on strong research universities. And you see the same in Korea. So is the model that we talk about, that the countries that are represented here, the model that we talk about, is it still a model based on this German Humboldtian vision, which put curiosity central? Or is it another kind of model? Is it necessary that we have strong research universities? Apparently not. But what kind of future model do we see? What role does ICT and online education play? Is it also in the current knowledge economy necessary that medical faculties, which in the US and many European countries have grown out of the university because they're too complex, too large, too difficult to steer, too expensive, etc., they become separate parts of the university already. So I was just trying to, because there was very little reflection on in these economies that are among the fastest growing in the world, while the traditional dominant powers are struggling, there was very little vision on what kind of university are we actually talking about. And a lot of referring to this template, which is an old European template. Is that a template that fits the rapidly developing Indian, Chinese, South African, Brazilian economies and societies? But it's maybe more a political question, and maybe there are politicians that have a vision. Well, but that's probably too much to hope for. In my country, there are no politicians with a vision, at least not on higher education.
Yeah. Thank you. Could I just add to that, to what Peter said, and willing to have a bit of a meta discussion and building on what Peter was referring. In the book that Peter and Johan Olsen edited in 2007, Johan Olsen came up with 4 visions of the university. The traditional community of scholars, which is linked to the Humboldt model that Peter was referring to. The representative democracy, which was so prominent in the US and Europe in the late 60s and 70s. The service enterprise model, which is more linked to the idea of the entrepreneurial university. And lastly, this notion of the university as an instrument or a tool for reaching certain policy agendas. And I was trying to position the different countries into this typology on the basis of the data you provided. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me, in the case of China, is relatively straightforward. The Chinese model, prominent model, is the instrumental model. The university is seen as a tool, as an arm of government, okay, as a tool for reaching certain objectives, policy objectives, in this case economic development, innovation, world class, and so on. In the Brazilian case, it seems the model is in the middle of the traditional community of scholars, right, with a number of dominant institutions with their own life. So in this case, a very strong institutionalized tradition with academics being the guardians of the values and the norms and the traditions of the university, right? The recent case of the experiment in São Paulo to extend the campus in a poverty area, and the failed attempt represents that, the strength of an institutionalized tradition of the old model, if you want, of the classic model. But also, Elizabeth elucidated to the fact that there's a paralysis around the representative democracy. You have all these vested interests. Everyone has a say. And basically what comes out of that, there's no coherent vision coming out. And I think someone was telling me at the break, some rectors in Brazilian universities realized after some time they actually have very little power because of those vested interests. So I'd say the Brazilian model is perhaps in the margin of those, the 2 classic models of representative democracy and the community of scholars. And then we have South Africa and India. On the basis of what the colleagues were saying, the focus on privatization, one would assume that South Africa is moving towards the service enterprise model. The Indian model. I think that the story perhaps is more complex than that, because you shed light on the equity dimension, concerns towards quality, and so it's not entirely, or perhaps it's a mix. So I'm looking forward to hear more from you on that. So I can't really place. The South African model, I think, is fascinating because we have done a lot of work in South Africa, and it seems there's a model that is really in the middle of the typology, right? All these four visions are prominent in the South African model. You have very strong institutionalized traditions in the few, perhaps 4 or 5, very strong research-intensive universities that are there. I think they are dominant. They, to an extent, are buffered from some of the guidelines coming from, so they have their own life, and they have, in a way, developed their own turf, similarly to other strong institutions in other countries. At the same time, you also have, linked to the idea of transformation, the representative democracy, with students and unions, and their interests coming to the fore, and so on, and perhaps that also creating some paralysis. And there's also a kind of a knowledge discourse emerging, although in the Arana project we noticed that it's still loosely coupled in terms of policy, and a move towards the market. So I think the South African model is, it was more a reflection than a question, but sort of picking on Renato's question on these visions, perhaps but it seems that overall the meta-narrative is that there isn't a consensus, to going back to the notion of the pact, there isn't a consensus amongst the various stakeholders involved of what the role of, excluding China, or what the role of higher education is supposed to be. Is it equity and, and promotion of social mobility and so on? Is it efficiency, excellence, innovation? Or it's a combination of those. So it goes back to the eternal dilemma of higher education, how to jingle these two dimensions. Thank you.
Just to say that actually what we get, I think in case of Brazil, but also in India, I think probably in other countries, is that you have a multiplicity of models responding to different demands. I mean, for most of the presentation of Elizabeth was based on the public system, but the private system, which 75% of the enrollment, is completely different. They are autonomous, they can decide what they want, they respond to the markets, and it's completely different. And if you go to inside the university, one of the public universities, and you go to engineering school, they are doing projects and they are responding to the demand of the private sector, of big public companies or corporations, and other people are doing academic research, and then the social science department is completely different. So I think that probably what is emerging very much in most countries is a very diversified system with different institutions responding to different situations and different stakeholders. And that is just the idea that you have a university, a model doesn't hold. Of course, I think that's a weakness of our project in this book here, because as I hear the discussion, I realize that we don't have a special place to discuss this kind of institutional model, which should be in the discussion, which we have to bring it in somewhere. But my own take on that is that actually we're not going into one direction, we're going into several directions at the same time.
I'm sorry, I'm going back to quality issues. I saw you, Kinjal, mentioning asymmetry of information, sufficiency of information has a lot to do with quality. Beth also talking about that society in Brazil is now involved in demanding quality. To what do you attribute it? To these unfair rankings that are published? So, and I would like to hear from China and South Africa too, about what kind of public information is provided to society and how much does it make a difference in terms of improving quality or creating conditions to users and stakeholders demand more quality.
Okay, now we go back to the speakers and then we go home.
Some people in the audience actually can answer the question fairly well, much better than I do. Chinese situation is very different. Chinese system is highly centralized, and they have annual assessment, quality assessment done by the Ministry of Education. I think I'm right. If I'm wrong, correct me, okay? And this is very regular routine exercise. Did I answer your question? Is that an answer? They regularly assess their universities. I also need to add with this is other assessment published. Well, when I lecture, very often I have delegations from mainland China. They come to Hong Kong and I lecture them. I say, look, the major difference between Hong Kong's assessment and mainland's assessment is Hong Kong's assessment, similar assessment. Australia too, annual assessment. But every assessment, the result published openly on the website. And you can clearly see how they address the issues raised by their assessors. China, no. China, no. Another issue is in China, hopefully I'm not, it's also to some extent, it's a fairly corrupt exercise because they know who are going to assess them. And you know what I mean. So, and Australia, I know, and I once mentioned this in Australia in a conference, and the vice chancellor, the pro-vice chancellor, I don't want to name the person, but the pro-vice chancellor of University of Sydney say, oh, that's not a very unique China. That's not a very China unique. That's actually also practiced in Australia because Australia university know who are going to assess them, and they try to leave a good impression. But China just go to some extent too far.
I think the question is about quality. I did say that South Africa established a Council for Higher Education, which had mainly two roles: to advise the minister as well as to play a regulatory mechanism in the system. It has played quite a fair, I think the public's assessment would be that the role that it has played as a regulatory and a quality assurance body, it has done a fairly good job. But remember that we're talking about 23 institutions. That for us is not the question. The question is how soon can we move from the historical past? Because the new government inherited institutions that are already set in terms of known traditions about which are the top institutions, which are in the middle, which are at the bottom, what can be expected. So society has got its own views, depending also on the historical past. I said that South African higher education institutions have been deracialized. That's not quite true. It's only those which were white institutions, mainly, and black students have moved into white institutions, Indian institutions. It's not happened vice versa, as the same as the communities. So you still find black institutions which, even if they are doing a reasonable good job, are seen by society as being Bush institutions. So there's a historical past, there's a quality assurance body, there's a historical past. But also the top institutions, I think Peter said we've got about 5 top institutions. They are fighting their own battle at the top there about who is in the ranks of these QS and this what, because of, are they in the 100th or 200 university in the world, the research outputs. So you find an extremely differentiated system, not because of quality, because of the history of the higher education system that is becoming intractable and difficult to move away from some of the perceptions.
Again, going back to Peter sir and Romulus sir, I guess even once I would be finished, you would still say, oh, so it still remains complex. I'll just try to explain the situation, and maybe then you can decide what model would it best fit in. But it is still complex. I'll just try to give the best justice. Almost 50%, maybe more lopsided towards private higher education, the system is. Now, we're very clear. Public higher education, even in its vision statement, mentions equitable access as the vision. So very clearly, we are on that side. And so the resulting aspects on quality and efficiency remains still questionable because we're working with that objective, and that too, I guess, to what extent are we able to achieve, I sincerely doubt, because as we could see in the table that my colleague showed, it's stagnated. The growth in the higher education institutes stagnated. And still, your vision remains increasing equitable access. So where else do you try to achieve that vision from? Inviting private institutes. Now, in private institutes, it's worked more as a ceasefire, I guess. And as Joshi Saab said today morning, that, it's how it slowly started peeping in the higher education. So it's like 2 institutes coming up, then there are 4, 6, and nobody realized, and suddenly there are so many private higher education institutes. So maybe it was not with a very well thought of, planned vision that we invited the private higher education. Nevertheless, private higher education, if we could see, they are working more with the professional courses, and that's very logical because they'll be only interested in marketable courses. They'll not be interested in something that they'll not sell. So, what vision are they working with? They cannot afford not to work without efficiency and quality. The only criteria that they would be able to work is perform or perish. Right? And we have so many cases in management sector where so many institutes just shut down. They are like fly-by-night kind of institutes. So they cannot afford but to have a vision of efficiency-oriented, qualitative higher education institutes, because it's very logical. If I'm running a private higher education institute, my source of income is students' fees. Right? So student will be giving me the fees only if he sees, or at least he perceives, that he'll get good returns. Only then he comes and invests in my institute. So it's immediately associated with what employer is ready to pay for my value-added student. Right? So they cannot afford but to have efficiency and quality focus with the private institutes. And they are obviously into increasing the access. So as I said, probably we are still landing in a suggestion saying that it's a complex case. But if 50-50 we were to see, public has, MHRD says, at least in its vision statement, ministry says equitable access. And obviously now this the Prime Minister at least talks about focusing more on quality aspects as well.
Well, it's for me to finish this discussion. I would say that, Romulo, you are partially right. I think in the public sector, issues are balancing between a more traditional model and a more representative model. What I was talking about, the confederation of communities inside the public universities, it's really a problem. It doesn't mean that the university, the authorities, the central rectory of the university has no policy, but they have small capabilities to really impose this kind of policies inside the university. For instance, I was collecting some data about services the university, the Polytechnic, our engineering school have done in the last few years. The university doesn't know. I said, well, you don't know how many startups, industries, no, how much money they are doing. No, please, we don't want to know, please. I don't want to talk. This is a very sensitive issue. We don't want to talk about it. So this is a real fragmented institution, and this is a very good institution. But I think that there is strength, that the way they deal with so many pressures from different stakeholders in society is just to leave everything in its own niche to deal with it, and then you just think that some way it will be work out a way about it. And then what the figure that is not in this picture is the private sector. The private sector, I think that they are instrumental, they are strong. Some of them are very linked to motivated by the issue about quality, employability, high level quality of programs and things like that, which is the elite private sector in Brazil. And then there is another private sector which is mass-oriented. I used to say that they are confined in a kind of commodity-like market where the price is the best way to survive. So you need to charge the least possible tuition in order to survive in this kind of market. So for this kind of institution, scale is the only way you can answer. So this kind of institution is moved to become a very huge for-profit institution. I would not say that they are totally instrumental, but they try to be instrumental for their own constitution. So I think that Simon launched a very good picture. These, I think, all the BRIC countries are experiencing a huge process of differentiation inside the higher education. Many different, even if you have the same institutional model, institutions are different. There are some institutions that are focusing on regional development, regional needs, others that are trying to become a player in the international landscapes. Then there are institutions that are catering for students with lower scholarly skills, then they are more remedial in their approach of education. And I think that we should recognize these roles, and also I think that we should evaluate this kind of role. It's important for our societies, I think, to have institutions of open doors. It's important for us to have an institution that can take a student that were illiterate in almost 3 years ago, and then in 3 years, some way he studied, he have done some kind, and then he got a certificate of a secondary, young adult secondary education. And then they want to go to the university. They are not, they cannot be one big public with some kind of inclination for us a research university cannot deal with this kind of student. We cannot deal. Even these students that are going into our public sector through the quota, they are passing through an examination, a competition. We are not dealing with this poor student that almost don't know really how to write in Portuguese. But someone need to take care of these students. So we need this differentiation, and I think that we should prize these different types of institutions that are in our higher education system. But that's all.
So tomorrow we start at 9, and thank you very much, you all, for your patience. It's time to go.